It started with a whisper, quiet, controlled, and quickly buried within palace corridors. But when King Charles III summoned senior aides after a late-night briefing involving Mike Tindall, the mood shifted. By morning, Zara Tindall was no longer scheduled for her next engagement. Something had gone very wrong. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A reshuffled diary here, a postponed appearance there, nothing unusual on the surface, nothing that would typically raise alarms in an institution as meticulously managed as the British monarchy. But insiders began to notice a pattern, one that didn't align with routine adjustments. Reports suggest that within hours of that late-night briefing, Clarence House became the center of an unusual flurry of activity. Calls were made, meetings were arranged, and perhaps most telling of all, senior aides were instructed firmly, and without explanation, to maintain absolute silence. That kind of directive is rare. In a system that thrives on controlled messaging rather than complete suppression, silence itself becomes a signal, and this time, it was deafening. Those familiar with palace operations began whispering about the tone of that emergency meeting. Not heated, not chaotic, but urgent in a way that felt calculated, almost surgical. There was no room for speculation, no tolerance for leaks. The focus, according to various interpretations, was singular: contain whatever had surfaced involving Mike Tindall before it could spiral beyond control. Yet even within that tightly guarded environment, unease began to ripple outward. Aides described the atmosphere as tense but deliberate, suggesting that whatever had been uncovered was not entirely unexpected, but its timing, its potential fallout, had clearly forced the king's hand. Then came the decision that would turn quiet concern into public intrigue. Zara Tindall's upcoming appearances, carefully scheduled weeks in advance, were abruptly pulled. No explanation, no substitute narrative. Just a clean, immediate withdrawal from public view. For a royal known for her consistency, for her refusal to engage in unnecessary drama, the move felt jarring. Senior royals, according to insiders, were caught off guard. Some reportedly learned of the change only after it had already been implemented, a detail that speaks volumes about how tightly this situation was being controlled at the highest level. And still, the whispers persisted. Media insiders began to sense that something was off, even as official channels remained silent. There were no statements, no denials, no carefully crafted reassurances, just a growing void where information should have been. That void, as it often does, began to fill itself. Early murmurs pointed toward Mike Tindall, hinting at recent activities that may have crossed an invisible line, one defined not by law, but by the unspoken expectations of royal conduct. The nature of those activities remained unclear, obscured by layers of discretion and deliberate ambiguity. But the reaction from within the palace suggested something serious enough to warrant immediate action. And perhaps the most telling detail of all was not what was said, but what wasn't. The media blackout held, at least initially. No leaks, no anonymous briefings, no subtle corrections. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't calm speculation, it amplifies it. Because when an institution built on image and continuity suddenly retreats into secrecy, it raises a question that refuses to go away. What exactly are they trying to protect? And more importantly, at whose expense? Because while the situation may have centered on Mike, it was Zara who disappeared from view. Zara who bore the immediate consequence. And as the days passed without clarification, without resolution, one question began to echo louder than the rest, one that would soon demand an answer the palace could no longer avoid. But what exactly happened behind closed doors, and why did Zara pay the immediate price? For years, Zara Tindall and Mike Tindall represented something rare within royal circles, a grounded, relatable partnership untouched by palace drama. But beneath that polished image, cracks may have been forming long before the public ever noticed. Zara had always occupied a unique space within the monarchy. She was close enough to the institution to carry its expectations, yet distant enough to avoid its suffocating weight. No official title, no relentless spotlight. Just a quiet consistency that earned her respect across both royal and public circles. She showed up, did the work, and left without spectacle. It was a rhythm that felt authentic, almost immune to the turbulence that had shaken other members of the royal family. And for years, that steadiness became her shield-proof, that it was possible to exist within the royal orbit without being consumed by it. Mike, on the other hand, brought a different energy. Charismatic, outspoken, and unapologetically modern, he bridged two worlds with ease. As a former athlete, he carried a kind of credibility that felt refreshingly detached from palace traditions. He could speak freely, laugh openly, and connect with audiences in a way that many royals simply couldn't. Together, they formed a partnership that felt balanced, her quiet discipline anchoring his larger-than-life presence. It worked. More than that, it resonated. They became, in many ways, the monarchy's most relatable figures. But relatability, as it turns out, can be a double-edged sword. Because their position, royal adjacent yet publicly accessible, came with an unspoken risk. They were close enough to the institution to reflect its image, yet independent enough to operate outside its strict controls. And over time, that independence began to shift. Interviews became more frequent. Appearances grew less restrained. The boundaries that once felt clear started to blur, almost imperceptibly at first. There was no single moment, no obvious turning point, just a gradual expansion of visibility that, according to insiders, began to raise quiet concerns behind palace walls. At first, those concerns were subtle. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Nothing official, nothing documented. But within an institution that thrives on control, even the smallest deviation can echo louder than expected. Reports suggest that some within royal circles began to question whether the Tindalls' increasing public presence was drifting too far from the carefully curated image the monarchy works tirelessly to maintain. Not because they had done anything overtly wrong, but because they were becoming too visible, too unfiltered, too unpredictable. And then, the perception began to shift. It wasn't immediate. It rarely is. But over the past year, something changed in the way they were viewed, not just by the public, but by those within the institution itself. The same openness that once made them appealing started to feel risky. The same accessibility that drew people in began to blur the lines between private and public life. And in a monarchy where every action carries weight, that kind of ambiguity can quickly become a liability. Insiders whisper that the concern wasn't about a single incident, but about a pattern, a slow, steady movement away from the quiet discipline that had once defined Zara's role. And as that pattern became harder to ignore, the tolerance that once protected them began to thin. Because in the end, the monarchy doesn't fear noise, it fears unpredictability. And unpredictability, no matter how subtle, is something it cannot afford to overlook, which is why, when the moment finally came, it didn't feel sudden to those who had been watching closely. It felt inevitable. Like the quiet tension had finally reached its breaking point. And then came the moment that turned quiet concerns into a full-blown royal crisis. It wasn't supposed to go public. But when details of Mike Tindall's alleged scandal began circulating among insiders, the palace had already moved into damage control mode. At first, it existed only in fragments, quiet exchanges between those who were never meant to speak, carefully worded concerns passed through private channels. Reports suggest that something had happened, something that crossed a line not written in law, but deeply embedded within royal expectation. The nature of the incident remained frustratingly unclear, wrapped in conflicting accounts and deliberate ambiguity. Some insiders hinted at inappropriate behavior during a recent private event. Others suggested a controversial interaction that, under normal circumstances, might have faded into obscurity. But these were not normal circumstances. Not when the individual involved carried even the slightest proximity to the crown. What made it more volatile was the timing. According to those familiar with the situation, the alleged incident occurred just days, perhaps even hours, before a series of scheduled royal engagements. That proximity transformed what might have been manageable into something far more dangerous. Because in the monarchy, timing is everything. A misstep at the wrong moment doesn't just reflect on the individual, it casts a shadow over the institution itself. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether something had happened, but how quickly it could be contained before it spiraled beyond control. Inside the palace, the response was immediate and calculated. Officials moved swiftly, not with panic, but with precision. Every detail had to be verified, every account cross-checked, every potential leak anticipated. It wasn't just about understanding what had occurred, it was about controlling how, and if, it would ever be understood by the public. Sources close to internal operations describe a tightening of communication channels, a deliberate narrowing of information flow. Only a select few were briefed fully. Others were given just enough to follow instructions without asking questions. It was, in every sense, a containment strategy. But containment is never perfect. Not in an environment where information moves as quietly as it does quickly. Media outlets, always alert to shifts within royal circles, began to sense that something was unfolding behind the scenes. At first, they held back, perhaps out of caution, perhaps due to lack of confirmation. But the absence of official narrative only fueled speculation. Because when the palace says nothing, it rarely means there is nothing to say. And within royal circles, the pressure began to build. There were those who believed the situation could still be managed quietly, handled internally without public fallout. But others saw the risk differently. They understood that silence, if prolonged, could become its own form of exposure. That waiting too long might allow the story to take on a life of its own, shaped not by facts, but by assumption. And so, the question shifted from whether to act, to how decisively that action should be taken. Because this was no longer just about Mike, it was about perception, about control, about the fragile balance between private missteps and public responsibility. And as the internal debate intensified, one reality became impossible to ignore. Someone would have to bear the immediate weight of this unfolding crisis. And in a decision that would soon raise more questions than answers, the focus moved swiftly, and without warning, away from the center of the scandal itself. Because while the scandal centered on Mike, it was Zara Tindall who faced the immediate consequences. In a monarchy built on image and discipline, hesitation can be costly. And by all accounts, King Charles III did not hesitate. The moment the situation reached him in full, stripped of rumor, distilled into its most urgent implications, the response was set in motion with a precision that spoke of experience, not emotion. Reports suggest that emergency consultations were convened almost immediately, drawing in a tight circle of senior royals and trusted advisors. There were no extended deliberations, no visible fractures in authority. Instead, there was alignment, quiet, controlled, and unmistakably firm. Because within the structure of the monarchy, decisions of this magnitude are rarely improvised, they are executed. And this, by all indications, was an execution of protocol at its most decisive. Those familiar with internal discussions described the tone as measured but unyielding. Every angle was considered, not just the immediate fallout, but the long-term implications for the crown's already delicate standing. The monarchy, still navigating modern scrutiny, could not afford ambiguity. Not now. Not when public trust hinges on the perception of stability and control. And so the focus shifted rapidly from investigation to action. Not public action, not yet, but something far more strategic. Something designed to contain, to isolate, to send a message without saying a word. That message came in the form of Zara Tindall's sudden removal from public duties. It was done quietly. No announcement, no formal acknowledgement. Just a subtle but unmistakable absence where presence had once been guaranteed. Her scheduled appearances disappeared from official listings, her role, however unofficial, suspended without explanation. To the outside world, it appeared temporary, perhaps even routine. But within royal circles, the implications were understood immediately. This was not a simple adjustment. It was a line being drawn. Insiders suggest that the decision was framed internally as a precautionary measure, temporary, reversible, necessary under the circumstances. But beneath that framing lay a deeper strategy, one that extended far beyond Zara herself. Because in moments like this, the monarchy doesn't just respond to events, it recalibrates its position. It reinforces boundaries. It reminds both insiders and observers that proximity to the crown is not a shield, but a responsibility. And when that responsibility is perceived to be at risk, action follows, swiftly, decisively. There are echoes here of past royal crises, moments when individuals were distanced not for what they had definitively done, but for what their presence might represent. The monarchy has long understood that perception can be as powerful as reality. That sometimes preserving the institution requires difficult, even uncomfortable choices. And according to those close to the situation, this was one of those moments. A decision not driven by sentiment, but by necessity. Cold but necessary. That's how some insiders have described it. a phrase that captures both the emotional weight of the move and the logic behind it, because there is no denying the personal cost. Zara, by all accounts, had done nothing directly to warrant such an immediate withdrawal, and yet she became the focal point of a response aimed at something much larger than any single individual, which is where the tension truly begins to take shape. Because while the monarchy presents unity, its decisions often reveal something more complex beneath the surface, a constant negotiation between loyalty and duty, between family and institution. And in this case, that balance appears to have tipped in a direction that raises uncomfortable questions. Not just about what happened, but about why the response unfolded the way it did. Because when a system acts this quickly, this decisively, it's rarely just reacting, it's protecting something. Or someone. And that leads to the question now echoing beyond palace walls, growing louder with every passing day. A question that cuts through the carefully controlled silence and demands clarity. Yet behind this calculated move lies a deeper question: was Zara being protected or sacrificed? Inside the royal family, the fallout was immediate and deeply personal. What had begun as a tightly controlled response quickly unraveled into something far more complicated behind closed doors. Reports suggest that senior members of the family were caught between instinct and obligation, between the natural pull of loyalty and the unyielding demands of the institution they serve. Some reacted with quiet shock, others with measured concern. And then there were those who, according to insiders, didn't entirely agree with how swiftly events had unfolded. Not openly, of course. Disagreement within the monarchy rarely announces itself. It lingers in pauses, in careful wording, in conversations that never quite reach the surface. But it was there, subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The decision involving Zara Tindall created ripples that extended far beyond her immediate circumstances. Because Zara was not just another name within the royal orbit, she was trusted, respected, and, perhaps most importantly, predictable. Her sudden absence disrupted more than schedules, it disrupted a sense of stability that many within the family had come to rely on. And as that absence stretched on without explanation, it began to create tension in places where silence had once been enough. Insiders whisper of strained dynamics emerging between key figures. Not confrontations, those are rare, but a growing sense of unease. Questions left unasked. Opinions left unspoken. Because in a system where unity is paramount, even the suggestion of division can feel dangerous. And yet, the situation seemed to demand reflection. Had the response been too severe? Too immediate? Or was it the only way to prevent something far worse? At the center of it all was Zara herself. According to those close to her, her response was not one of defiance, but of quiet withdrawal. Devastation, some have suggested, though never publicly confirmed. She had built her role on consistency, on trust, on staying just within the boundaries that allowed her to operate freely without overstepping. And now, without warning, that balance had been disrupted. Not by her own actions, but by circumstances she could neither control nor fully address. The emotional weight of that reality, insiders claim, was significant. Because in the monarchy, perception doesn't just shape reputation, it defines it. Meanwhile, Mike Tindall found himself under increasing scrutiny, not just from the outside world, where speculation was beginning to gain momentum, but from within the very circles that had once embraced him so easily. The same charisma that had made him relatable now seemed to invite closer examination. Every past appearance, every public comment, every moment of openness, suddenly, it all felt subject to reinterpretation. And as the pressure mounted, the absence of a clear narrative only made things worse. Because outside the palace walls, the silence was no longer holding. Public speculation began to intensify, fueled not by confirmed details, but by the lack of them. Media outlets, initially cautious, started to push further, asking questions that had no official answers. Social conversations grew louder, more divided. Some defended Zara, seeing her as an unfair casualty. Others questioned the monarchy's handling of the situation, wondering whether the response revealed more about internal priorities than the incident itself. And with every passing day, the gap between what was known and what was assumed continued to widen. This is the monarchy's most difficult position, caught between protecting its image and preserving its relationships. Because every decision carries a cost. Protect the institution too aggressively, and you risk alienating those within it. Prioritize loyalty, and you risk weakening the structure that holds it all together. It is a balance that must be maintained constantly, carefully, and often without acknowledgement. But this time, that balance felt more fragile than usual, because the longer the silence continued, the more it began to speak for itself. And as questions multiplied without answers, one reality became increasingly clear. This was no longer just an internal matter. It had become a public one. And as the silence stretched on, the public began asking the question the palace couldn't avoid. When the story finally broke, the reaction was swift and deeply divided. What had once been contained within palace walls now moved freely through public conversation, and almost instantly, the tone of that conversation revealed a fracture. Sympathy, in overwhelming measure, seemed to settle around Zara Tindall. For many, her sudden withdrawal felt less like a justified response and more like an undeserved consequence, an emotional reaction to what appeared, from the outside, to be a situation she did not create. The narrative forming around her was one of quiet resilience interrupted, of a figure who had played by the rules now facing the weight of a decision she never made. And that perception carried power, because in the court of public opinion, fairness often matters more than protocol. At the same time, scrutiny around Mike Tindall intensified. The ambiguity surrounding the alleged incident did little to protect him. In fact, it seemed to do the opposite. Without clear details, speculation filled the gaps, and not always in his favor. Every rumor, every unverified claim added another layer to a story that was quickly becoming larger than its original source. And in that expanding narrative, Mike's public persona, once seen as approachable and authentic, began to shift. Not completely, not universally, but enough to raise questions that hadn't been asked before. But perhaps the most complex reaction was directed not at either of them, but at the monarchy itself. Because as more details, or at least interpretations of those details, began to surface, the focus turned toward the palace's response. Had it acted too quickly, too harshly, or had it, in fact, not gone far enough? The debate unfolded in real time, across media platforms and public forums, with no clear consensus. Some argued that the decision to remove Zara was a necessary step to protect the institution, a demonstration that no one, no matter how respected, is beyond accountability. Others saw it differently. They questioned whether the response revealed an imbalance, a tendency to prioritize image over individual fairness. And in that questioning, a deeper conversation began to take shape. Media narratives evolved almost as quickly as the story itself. What began as cautious reporting soon shifted into layered analysis, with outlets revisiting past royal controversies, drawing comparisons, highlighting patterns. Why did some individuals face immediate consequences while others seemed to navigate similar storms with less visible impact? Was this a matter of timing, of circumstance, or something more structural? These weren't easy questions, and they didn't come with easy answers. But they were being asked, repeatedly, publicly. And then there was the role of social media, unfiltered, relentless, and impossible to contain. Platforms became arenas for speculation, theory, and interpretation, often blurring the line between informed opinion and pure conjecture. Narratives formed and reformed within hours. Allegiances shifted. And through it all, the absence of a definitive statement from the palace only fueled the momentum. Because in a digital age, silence doesn't slow a story down, it accelerates it. What emerged from all of this was not just a reaction to a single event, but a broader reflection on how the monarchy is perceived in moments of crisis. Questions of fairness, consistency, and transparency began to surface with increasing frequency. And while some defended the institution's need for discretion, others saw that discretion as part of the problem, a barrier between the monarchy and the public it represents. Because this is no longer just about what happened, it's about how it was handled, about who was affected, about what it reveals beneath the surface of a system built on tradition but operating in a world that demands accountability. And as the conversation continues to evolve, one thing becomes clear: the impact of this moment extends far beyond the individuals at its center. But beyond public opinion lies a far more critical issue: what this means for the monarchy's future. This isn't just about one scandal, it's about the survival of an institution built on perception. Because beneath the immediate fallout beyond the headlines and speculation, lies a deeper tension that has defined the monarchy for generations: the constant struggle to remain credible in a world that no longer accepts mystery without question. The crown has always relied on a delicate balance of tradition on one side, public trust on the other. But that balance is becoming harder to maintain. Every decision is now examined, every silence interpreted, every action weighed not just for what it does, but for what it suggests. And in moments like this, when uncertainty replaces clarity, the institution finds itself walking a line that feels thinner than ever. At the center of that balancing act is King Charles III, a figure whose leadership is being tested in ways both visible and unseen. Reports suggest that his approach has been shaped by a need for control not out of rigidity, but out of necessity. He inherited not just a crown, but a climate of scrutiny, one where every decision carries the weight of legacy. And now, faced with a situation that threatens to blur the lines between personal misstep and institutional risk, his response reflects a broader strategy: protect the monarchy first, even if it comes at a cost, because there is always a cost. Protecting the crown's image is not a passive act. It requires decisions that can feel calculated, even unforgiving. It demands a willingness to distance individuals when their presence risks overshadowing the institution itself. This is not new, it is a pattern, one that has surfaced time and again throughout royal history. When controversy emerges, the response often follows a familiar structure: isolate, contain, and, if necessary, remove. Not as punishment, but as preservation. The monarchy does not operate on emotion, it operates on continuity. And in this moment, Zara Tindall appears to have become part of that pattern, not because of her own actions, but because of her proximity to the situation. Because in a system where perception defines reality, association can carry as much weight as involvement. Zara's withdrawal, then, begins to look less like an isolated decision and more like a strategic move within a larger framework, one designed to protect the institution at all costs. And that realization shifts the narrative. It reframes her role, not as the center of the story, but as a figure shaped by forces beyond her control. This is where the emotional tension deepens, because while the monarchy presents itself as a unified entity, its internal dynamics are far more complex. Decisions made for the sake of the institution can ripple through personal relationships, altering trust, reshaping alliances, and leaving lasting impressions that are rarely visible to the outside world. Insiders suggest that moments like this don't just resolve, they linger. They influence how future decisions are made, how roles are defined, how boundaries are understood. And over time, those shifts accumulate. What begins as a single response to a specific situation can evolve into something much larger, a recalibration of how the monarchy operates in an increasingly transparent world. Because the question is no longer just how to protect the crown, but how to do so without losing the very trust it depends on. And that is a question with no easy answer. Because every action, no matter how strategic, leaves behind a trace, a memory, a consequence. And as this particular chapter begins to move toward resolution, as the immediate tension starts to ease, what remains is not just the outcome, but the implications. The quiet understanding that something has changed, perhaps subtly, perhaps significantly, but changed nonetheless. And as the dust begins to settle, one final question remains unanswered. For now, the palace remains silent. But silence, in royal terms, rarely means the story is over. Because silence is not absence, it is strategy. It is the space where decisions are refined, where narratives are reshaped, where outcomes are carefully positioned before they are ever revealed. And in this moment, that silence feels heavier than ever. The absence of clarity surrounding Zara Tindall's future has created a vacuum, one filled not with answers, but with anticipation. Will she return to public duties as if nothing happened? Or has something more permanent already been set in motion behind closed doors? Insiders offer no definitive direction, only fragment suggestions that her role is under review, that timelines remain fluid, that nothing is being rushed, yet nothing is being left to chance. At the same time, attention quietly shifts toward Mike Tindall. Not with the same immediate intensity as before, but with a growing sense of inevitability. Reports suggest that he may begin stepping further out of the spotlight, not through formal removal, but through gradual absence. Fewer appearances, less visibility. A slow retreat that mirrors the monarchy's preference for subtle recalibration over dramatic confrontation. Because in this institution, change rarely arrives with announcement. It unfolds over time, almost imperceptibly, until one day, the difference is undeniable. Behind the scenes, the process continues. Internal reviews, according to those familiar with palace operations, are ongoing, quiet, methodical, and deliberately shielded from public view. Every detail is being examined, not just for what it reveals about the present situation, but for what it might mean moving forward. There are discussions, negotiations, adjustments being considered at levels the public will likely never see. Because this is not just about resolving a moment, it is about preventing the next one. And yet, outside those guarded walls, the story refuses to settle. Media outlets remain engaged, probing for new information, revisiting old details, connecting threads that may or may not lead anywhere definitive. Speculation continues to evolve, shaped by each new interpretation, each subtle shift in tone or absence of response. Social conversations persist, less explosive than before, but no less persistent. Because once a question has been asked at this scale, it doesn't simply fade, it lingers, waiting for something to confirm or challenge what people have already begun to believe. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so uncertain. Because there is still the possibility, however distant, that more could emerge, that the story as it is currently understood is incomplete, that what has been revealed so far is only part of a larger narrative still unfolding behind layers of discretion and control. Insiders do not confirm this, but they don't entirely dismiss it either, and in that ambiguity, the tension remains. The monarchy, for its part, appears to be preparing not just for resolution, but for consequence. Because regardless of how this situation ultimately concludes, its impact will not be easily erased. Trust, perception, internal dynamics, these are not elements that reset overnight. They shift, they adapt, and sometimes they leave behind traces that shape decisions long after the moment itself has passed. So the silence continues, not empty, but loaded, not passive, but purposeful. A pause before something, whether clarity, closure, or something far more complicated, finally emerges. Because in the world of royalty, the truth doesn't disappear, it waits. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.